A widow's lonely silence is shattered when a stranger appears at her gate thirsty, broken, and destined to become her greatest shield against the man who would claim everything she loves. Elias Thorne measured his life in the rhythm of his own two hands. The creak of saddle leather, the grit of dust under his nails, the solid weight of an axe handle, these were his constants. He owned what he could carry and slept where the sun went down, a man who had folded his past away like a worn map. He had learned long ago that words were liabilities, promises were snares, and the safest place to live was in the quiet hollow of his own chest. Now, in the baking heat of the plains, his horse was lame and his canteen was empty. The sun hammered the back of his neck. Thirst was a predator, patient and silent. He saw the distant line of a cottonwood, the dark slash of a roof against the brassy sky. It was a place. A place meant people, and people meant complications. But his body had made the choice for him. He took the reins of his limping horse and walked, each step a careful negotiation with the shimmering air. The house was small, tidy, its porch swept clean. A woman's touch was in the stubborn pot of geraniums near the door, their red petals a shout of life against the endless brown. He stopped at the gate, his throat too raw to call out. He just stood, a silhouette of a man at the edge of a life that was not his, and waited. It was all he knew how to do. Eleanora Vance's home was a fortress of solitude, each piece of furniture a memory of a life that was. The bed held the shape of one body, not two. The low lamp on the table cast a single shadow on the wall as she mended a shirt, the needle a tiny silver fish diving through warm cotton. The silence of the house was a familiar weight, a blanket she had long since stopped fighting. Her husband Thomas had been gone 2 years, taken by a fever that burned through him like a prairie fire. He had left her this land, this house, and a loneliness so vast it felt like a second person in the room. She was a survivor, hardened by grief and necessity. She ran the small farm herself, her hands chapped, her back strong. But at night, the quiet pressed in. That evening, the dog, a scruffy terrier named Gus, let out a low growl from the porch. Eleanora put her sewing aside, her movements calm, her senses sharp. She picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth and went to the door. Through the screen, she saw a man standing at her gate, holding the reins of a horse that favored one leg. He was tall, dust-caked, and still as a statue. He did not move, did not call out. He simply stood there, waiting to be seen. It was a posture she understood. It was not demanding. It was patient. She saw the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, the parched look of his skin. Her heart, a careful and guarded thing, felt a stir of something other than fear. It was a flicker of recognition, one solitary soul acknowledging another. She unlatched the screen door, the poker held loosely at her side. "You need water," she said. It was not a question. From Elias's point of view, the world returned in a rush of sensation. The cool shock of water from the dipper, the shade of the porch, the quiet scrutiny of the woman's gray eyes. She was not a girl. Her face was etched with a strength that life had demanded of her, her hands capable as she pumped the water for his horse. He drank slowly, letting the life seep back into him. He learned her name was Eleanora Vance, a widow. He offered to work for his keep until his horse was sound. He expected to be sent on his way. A lone man was a risk. Instead, she looked him over, her gaze missing nothing, and nodded once. "The barn," she said, pointing. "There's a cot. The pump handle is loose. See to it. I'll bring you a plate." He did as he was told. The barn was cool and smelled of hay and dry earth. He found the cot, a simple canvas bed, and set his bedroll upon it. Then he turned his attention to the pump. He worked with a deliberate economy of motion, his hands understanding the language of iron and wood. He diagnosed the problem: a worn bolt, a cracked washer. He found scraps in a discarded tool chest and began to improvise a repair. He was absorbed in the task, the familiar feel of the tools a comfort. When she appeared at the barn door with a plate of beans and cornbread, he did not startle. He had been aware of her approach, the soft scuff of her boots on the hard-packed dirt. He wiped his hands on a rag before taking the plate. "Thank you, Mom," he said. The words felt rough in his throat. She just nodded, her eyes on his hands, on the half-repaired pump. "It will hold?" she asked. "It will hold," he confirmed. She lingered for a moment, the silence stretching between them, not awkward, but watchful. He ate his meal on the barn steps while she went back to the house. From the corner of his eye, he could see her lamp glow to life in the window. A single light in the vast, gathering dark. For the first time in years, he was not entirely alone in it. Eleanora watched him from her kitchen window. She had done it all day, her chores a familiar rhythm against the new, uncertain presence of the man in her barn. He worked without stopping. He fixed the pump handle, then moved on to the sagging fence line by the creek, his movements steady and efficient. He did not sing or whistle. He simply worked, a quiet force of nature restoring order to the frayed edges of her world. She had taken a risk letting him stay. The women in town would have called her a fool. Silas Croft, the banker who held the note on her land and made his intentions all too clear, would have called her reckless. But there was something in the stranger's stillness that she trusted. He did not swagger. His eyes, when they had met hers, were clear and direct, holding no hidden appetite. He was a closed book, but the cover was not threatening. In the afternoon, she took him a jar of cool water. He was resetting a fence post, his shirt soaked with sweat, the muscles in his back and arms taut with effort. He stopped when he saw her, taking the jar with a quiet nod of thanks. He drank, his throat working. He handed it back, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The touch was nothing, a simple accident of transfer, but a jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. It was the first touch from a man that was not a handshake or a pat on the shoulder in 2 years. It felt solid, real. Later, as dusk settled, she saw him checking the perimeter of the property, his long strides eating up the ground. He was scanning, his gaze moving methodically over the horizon. It was the posture of a man accustomed to looking for threats. He was not just mending her fences, he was guarding them. She felt a knot in her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. He was a protector, not by command, but by instinct. That night, she lay in her bed and listened to the sounds of the homestead, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and a new sound, the soft cough of a man settling down to sleep in her barn. The silence of the house felt different. It was no longer empty. It was simply quiet. The days settled into a routine. Elias would rise with the sun and begin his work. He moved from one task to the next without needing to be told, his eyes seeing what needed to be done. He rehung a barn door, sharpened her axe, and weeded the vegetable patch with a surprising gentleness. He was a man who spoke with his hands, and his hands said he was capable, careful, and respectful of what was hers. Each day, she would leave a plate of food and a jar of water on the porch rail for him. They rarely spoke more than a few words. The latch on the smokehouse is repaired. Thank you. More rain. Coming. I see it. But a language was growing between them in the spaces between the words. It was in the way he stacked the firewood exactly as she liked it, the way she left an extra piece of cornbread on his plate. One afternoon, she was struggling to move a heavy feed sack. It was awkward and about to slip from her grasp. Suddenly, he was there, his shadow falling over her. He didn't speak, just held out his hands. She let go, and he lifted the sack as if it were nothing, placing it where she had intended. He then met her eyes, and for the first time, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It transformed his face, easing the stern lines. "Eleanora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, his voice low and a little rough, as if the word was new to him. "Thank you." "Elias," she replied, the name feeling solid and real on her tongue. It was a small moment, but it felt like a turning point. The formal barrier of ma'am and Mr. Thorne had dissolved, replaced by something more personal. That evening, as he cleaned his tools by the barn, he noticed a rattlesnake coiled near the woodpile. His movements were a blur of speed and precision. He dispatched it with a shovel, his face a mask of cold focus. He picked up the dead snake by the tail, carried it far out into the fields, and returned, his breathing even. He picked up the shovel, cleaned it, and returned it to its place against the barn wall, leaning it there for her to find. It was a silent message. "I am here. You are safe." The rain came just after dusk, a sudden, violent summer storm that turned the world to a fury of wind and water. Eleanora stood at her window, watching the lightning split the sky. A particularly vicious gust tore at the old cottonwood, and she heard a crack, then a splintering crash. The lights in town, a faint glimmer on the horizon, flickered and died. She was alone in the roaring dark. A thread of unease tightened inside her. Then she thought of Elias in the barn. The roof on that old structure was patchy at best. She lit a second lantern, its golden light a small rebellion against the storm. She pulled on a heavy oilcloth coat, took a deep breath, and opened the door to the maelstrom. The wind nearly snatched it from her hand. She fought her way across the yard, rain plastering her hair to her face. The barn door was open, and she could see him inside, trying to move sacks of seed away from a steady stream of water pouring through the roof. He was soaked to the skin, his shirt clinging to his back. "Elias!" She shouted over the roar of the storm. He turned, his face illuminated by the swaying lantern in her hand. "The roof won't hold," she yelled. "Come to the house." He hesitated, his gaze flickering from her to the relative shelter of the barn. He was a man who respected boundaries, and the house was her space. He would not cross its threshold without a clear invitation. "Elias, please," she said, her voice softer but carrying more weight than her shout. "Come inside." That was all it took. He nodded once, grabbed his bedroll, and followed her. Back in the house, the warmth and quiet felt like a sanctuary. He stood on the rug by the door, gripping onto the floorboards, looking out of place and immense in the small kitchen. "You can sleep by the hearth," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's warm there." She retrieved a thick quilt from a chest. He had shucked off his wet shirt and was shivering slightly in the cooler air of the house. The firelight played over the hard lines of his shoulders and back. She held out the quilt. He looked at her, then at the blanket, a question in his eyes. "May I?" she asked softly, a courtesy for a man who had shown her nothing but. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She stepped closer and draped the heavy quilt over his shoulders, her fingers brushing the damp skin of his neck. The contact was brief, but it was a deliberate act of care. He pulled the quilt tighter around himself, his eyes closing for a moment. "Thank you, Eleanora," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He settled by the fire, and she sat in her rocking chair nearby, the storm raging outside, a fragile peace settling within the four walls of her home. Elias sat by the fire, the wool of the quilt warm against his skin. He had never been inside her house before. It was like seeing a part of her that had been kept hidden. It smelled of dried herbs, wood smoke, and something uniquely her, like fresh linen and baked bread. It was a house built for a life, filled with the small, worn things that told its story. A faded photograph on the mantel of a smiling man, a stack of books by a chair, a child's small, carved bird on a shelf. He felt the weight of that history, the ghost of the man who belonged here. He was an intruder in this sanctuary. Yet she had invited him in. More than that, she had offered him comfort. He watched her as she sat in her rocking chair, her hands busy with a piece of mending, a firelight catching the silver threads in her hair. She was a woman who did not break, who simply bent with the wind and stood back up again. He felt a fierce, protective urge rise in him, so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. It was more than a duty to repay her kindness. It was a deep, instinctual need to keep this small circle of light safe from the darkness outside. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. As he was preparing to head back to the barn, a buggy pulled into the yard. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his face a mask of possessive concern. Elias recognized the type instantly. A man who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned. The man strode onto the porch without waiting for an invitation. "Eleanora," he called out, his voice overly familiar. "I came as soon as the road was clear. A woman alone in that storm." Eleanora came to the door, her face impassive. "I was fine, Silas." The man, Silas, finally noticed Elias standing in the kitchen doorway. His eyes narrowed. "And who is this?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "You have a hired hand now?" "Mr. Thorne is helping with some repairs," Eleanora said, her voice cool. Silas Croft's gaze swept over Elias, dismissing him as inconsequential. "Well, his work is done. I'm here now. You don't need to be taking in strays, my dear." "It isn't proper." Elias remained silent, his body a solid, unmoving presence in the doorway. He let Eleanora handle it. This was her home, her fight. But he watched Silas's hands, the way he stepped too close to her, the proprietary way his eyes roamed over her property. And Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this man was a far greater threat than any summer storm. Eleanora felt Silas Croft's presence like a stain on her clean morning. He walked into her yard as if he owned it, his smile thin and practiced. He had been circling since Thomas died, offering condolences that felt like bids at an auction. He wanted her land, which bordered his own, and he wanted her, a respectable widow, to manage his home and warm his bed. He saw her as a piece of property to be acquired. "A woman like you needs a man's protection," Silas said, his eyes flicking dismissively toward Elias, who was now checking the damage to the cottonwood. "Not some drifter of questionable character. Mr. Thorne has been a perfect gentleman," Eleanora replied, her spine stiffening. "His character is not in question." Of course," Silas said, patting her arm in a way that made her skin crawl. She pulled away. "But people will talk, Eleanora. A widow, a strange man living in her barn, it gives the wrong impression. A marriage would solve all of that. I could take that troublesome mortgage off your hands. You would be secure." It was a threat wrapped in the guise of an offer. Her security for her freedom, her dignity for his ownership. She looked past Silas to where Elias was working. He was sawing the fallen branch into manageable logs, his movements powerful and sure. He had not once looked their way, giving her the space to handle this. He trusted her to be strong, whereas Silas assumed she was weak. That difference was everything. "My situation is my own concern, Silas," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Thank you for stopping by." It was a clear dismissal. Silas's smile tightened. "Think on my offer, my dear. Sooner or later, every woman needs a husband." He climbed back into his buggy and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a foul taste in the air. The gossip he threatened was real. In a town this small, a woman's reputation was fragile currency. But as she watched Elias stack the wood from the fallen branch, turning a disaster into a future supply of warmth, she felt a surge of defiance. She would not be scared into a cage. She had survived loss. She would survive gossip. That evening, she made a decision. She walked to the barn as Elias was finishing his work. "The storm did some damage to the roof," she said, though they both knew it had leaked before. "It might be better if you stayed in the house for now. There's a small room off the kitchen." She held her breath. It was more than an offer of shelter. It was an invitation to cross a threshold, to move from a temporary arrangement to something more. Elias stood in the lamplight of her kitchen, the scent of coffee and something baking in the air. He had moved his meager belongings into the small room off the kitchen. It was little more than a pantry with a cot, but it was inside. It was warm. It was a world away from the barn. He felt the shift between them, a current of unspoken understanding. He was no longer just a hired hand passing through. He was a guest, a resident, something more. That night, after the simple meal they shared in comfortable silence at her small kitchen table, she did not immediately retire to her room. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her expression serious. "Silas Croft holds the note on this farm," she said, her voice low. "Thomas took a loan for the seed 2 seasons ago. He means to use it against me." Elias listened, his gaze steady on her face. He did not offer easy platitudes. He simply absorbed her words, understanding the weight of her confession. "He thinks he can force me to sell, or to marry him." The last words were spoken with a quiet disgust. "He will not," Elias said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, a promise. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the proud set of her jaw as she fought against it. He knew what it was to be cornered. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the wood. His touch was warm and firm, a silent anchor. "I will not let him harm you, Eleanora," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I will stay." Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw a vulnerability she showed to no one else. He saw her trust, a fragile and precious thing she was offering him. She turned her hand over, her fingers lacing with his. The small, intimate gesture was more binding than any contract. "I know," she whispered. He had come here seeking nothing but water and a place to rest. He had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a reason to stop wandering, a place to belong, a woman whose safety felt more important than his own. The following Sunday, the reckoning came. Eleanora was on her porch, mending a harness, when Silas Croft's buggy arrived again. This time, he was not alone. The town preacher, Reverend Michael, sat beside him, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Elias was nearby, splitting the last of the logs from the fallen tree, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady heartbeat in the tense silence. He had seen them coming, and had chosen a task that kept him close, his presence a silent statement. Silas strode up to the porch, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Eleanora," he said, his voice loud enough for the preacher to hear, "I have come to make a formal offer with the Reverend as my witness. I will assume the debt on this farm and take you as my wife. It is the only respectable solution to your situation." Eleanora slowly set down the harness and rose to her feet. She looked at the preacher, whose eyes darted nervously away, then at Silas, whose gaze was triumphant. He believed he had won. He had brought the weight of public opinion and religion to her doorstep, intending to crush her will. She felt a tremor of fear, but then she felt something else, the solid, steady presence of Elias just a few yards away. He had not stopped his work, but his rhythm had changed. He was listening, waiting, trusting her. She drew a deep breath. "There is no situation to solve, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the yard. Silas's smirk faltered. "Don't be a fool, woman. You have a man of no name living under your roof. You must marry." "I must do what I believe is right," she countered. She turned her head and looked directly at Elias. The sound of the axe had stopped. He stood straight, the axe held loosely in one hand, his eyes locked on hers. In that single silent gaze, a question was asked and an answer was given. She turned back to Silas. "I will not be marrying you, Mr. Croft. Not now, not ever." Silas's face turned purple with rage. "You would choose a penniless drifter over me?" "I would choose a good man over you," she corrected him. "And Mr. Thorne is a good man. He will be staying. This is his home now, too." The words hung in the air, a public declaration, a choice made in the clear light of day. Elias took a step forward, moving to stand at the bottom of the porch steps, not beside her, but slightly in front, a quiet shield. He said nothing, but his presence was an unshakable wall. The preacher cleared his throat, looking mortified. "Silas, perhaps this is not the time." "There is no time for you here, Mr. Croft," Eleanora said, her voice final. Defeated and humiliated, Silas Croft spun on his heel, stormed back to his buggy, and rode away, leaving the preacher to make his own awkward retreat. The dust settled, and they were alone. The silence that descended after the buggies departed was profound. It was the quiet after a storm, thick with unspoken things. Elias turned from the road and looked up at Eleanora on the porch. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. He saw the tremor in her hands as she gripped the porch rail. He mounted the steps, his boots heavy on the wood. He stopped in front of her. He didn't speak. Words were not what was needed. He simply reached out and took her trembling hands in his own, his large, warm palms enveloping hers completely. He held them until the shaking stopped. "I'll fetch you some water," he said, his voice a low murmur. He went inside and returned with a dipper from the bucket, holding it for her as she drank. It was a simple act of care, of restoring peace. He was tending to her as gently as he tended to a fragile seedling in her garden. After she drank, she gave him a watery, grateful smile. "Thank you, Elias." He just nodded, his eyes saying everything he could not. He went back to the woodpile, not to work, but to restore order. He stacked the newly split logs with meticulous care, the familiar, repetitive motion, a way of calming the turbulent emotions inside him. He had been a ghost for so long, a man without a place, and she, in front of God and the town, had claimed him. She had called her home his home. The weight of that gift, that trust, was immense. He had spent his life protecting himself. Now, all he wanted was to protect her. Later that afternoon, he brought the finished piece he'd been working on in his spare moments into the house. It was a small, beautifully carved footstool, made from a piece of seasoned oak he'd found in the barn. He had sanded it until it was smooth as glass and oiled it until the grain shone like honey. He set it down by her rocking chair. She came over, her fingers tracing the smooth, curved lines. It was a perfect, practical thing, made with a craftsman's skill and an artist's care. A gift not of money, but of time and devotion. "Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful. It's for you," he said. It was his way of saying everything else. "This is my devotion. This is my place. I am here to stay." He was no longer just a guest. He was a man building a life, one small, solid act at a time. That evening, the house was quieter than ever, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the deep, settled peace of a home that has weathered a storm and stands stronger for it. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm, golden circle around them, holding the vast darkness of the prairie at bay. The footstool was by her chair, a silent testament to the day's events. Eleanora looked at Elias, at his strong, calloused hands resting on the table. Hands that could fix anything, that could fell a tree, and that had held hers with such gentleness. He had given her his protection, his loyalty, his quiet, unwavering strength. He had asked for nothing in return. "My husband Thomas," she began, her voice soft, "he was a good man. He built this house, but he never saw me. Not the way you do. Elias looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. He saw the strength she tried to hide, the loneliness she never spoke of, the resilience that was the core of her. He saw all of it. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said, the words simple and unadorned, carrying the pure, unvarnished weight of truth. The air between them hummed with a deep, powerful emotion that had been building for weeks, growing in shared chores and silent understanding. It was a love built not on grand declarations, but on the steady foundation of mutual respect and quiet care. "I don't have much to offer," Elias said, his voice low and solemn. "No land, no name to speak of. Just my 2 hands. They are more than enough," she whispered. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. It felt like coming home. "I'll keep the fences strong," he said. It was a vow. It was not just about the wood and wire. It was a promise to protect their life, to guard their peace, to stand between her and anything that might ever wish her harm. She turned her hand over, her fingers lacing through his, a perfect fit. A smile, genuine and full of a light he had never seen before, transformed her face. "And I," she replied, her voice steady and sure, "will keep the hearth warm." It was their future, sealed not with a kiss or a ring, but with a quiet promise spoken in the lamplight. A promise of a shared home, a shared life, and a love that had found its voice in the silence.